Where's the conversation about peace? Every time we launch these interventionist regime change wars, it is not only our veterans who pay the price for that. Every single one of us pays the price. We have spent trillions of your taxpayer dollars to pay for these wars, taking those dollars away from our communities and our people who need them right here at home.
In America in 2020, it's very difficult to find a candidate to vote for who is against the military-industrial complex or these regime change wars. In 2020, on the Democratic side, there's two candidates, only two announced candidates, that are calling for an end to these wasteful wars and all this military spending, and that is Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman from Hawaii. Ironically, the Democrats, Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, agree with Rand Paul, current senator in the U.S. Senate. He's a Republican. Towards the end of this video, he gives a speech about the waste involved in all these wars. His father, Ron Paul, ran for president in 2012, and the next video clip is Ron Paul, Republican candidate for president, running in 2012, talking against regime change wars.
Iran does not have an air force that can come here, just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they had nuclear weapons, and we had to go in. I'm sure you supported that war as well. Yeah. Okay. It's time we quit this. It's time. It's trillions of dollars we're spending on these wars.
What's with the smirk and the eye roll? The guy gives it, the crowd goes nuts, and you do one of these. There goes crazy Uncle Ron, babbling about the unsustainability of multiple wars.
General Ricardo Sanchez, the commander of coalition forces in Iraq from 2003 to 2004.
There is tremendous progress going on in Iraq. They're making progress politically, economically, and definitely in security. We're not in a quagmire. The progress is unbelievable.
I like the cut of his soundbite. He's optimistic. Hey, what's he doing now?
There is no question that America is living a nightmare with no end in sight.
It seems retired General Sanchez has a bit of a different opinion than General Sanchez. And that's the subject of tonight's Now You Tell Us. Apparently, one of the medals General Sanchez received was for distinguished acts in the art of bull. These lies weighed on Sanchez. In his speech last Friday, Sanchez came clean.
There has been a glaring, unfortunate display of incompetent strategic leadership within our national leaders. Our National Security Council has been a failure. There is nothing going on today in Washington that would give us hope.
You know, you could try opening with a joke. Sir, if your estimate was so dim so early on, why didn't you tell us this back then? Why didn't you tell us then?
The last thing that you want is for currently serving general officers to stand up against our political leadership.
Really? That's the last thing you want? Let's look at Sanchez's hierarchy of bad things. The worst thing ever, standing up to political leadership. And that's preferable to, what's the phrase?
A nightmare with no end in sight.
Look for more of these tremendous insights in Ricardo Sanchez's new book, I Have Difficulty Judging the Worstness of Things.
And I know that there's a lot of controversy over your stance towards Syria. Do you believe that the U.S. should stop engagement militarily in Syria? And what would be your posture as president toward Bashar al-Assad?
Our military's mission and purpose is to keep the American people safe. So our troops deployed to Syria initially to work with the Kurdish forces on the ground to go after and defeat ISIS. That mission has largely been accomplished. Unfortunately, as this was happening since 2011, covertly initially with the CIA, there was a regime change war that was launched during that time. As part of that war, and many of you may not even be aware of this, but our taxpayer dollars were being used to provide both direct and indirect support to terrorist groups in Syria like Al-Qaeda and others in order to go in and topple the Assad government. I had a chance to go to Syria, where I heard from the Syrian people. I heard from religious leaders who pleaded and begged for the United States to stop this support because they knew Whether there were some who supported their Assad government, others wanted to see him go, they knew that if the United States and other countries were successful in this regime change war, the most powerful force on the ground would fill that vacuum. And the most powerful force were these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, whose sole mission was to wipe out Christians and other religious minorities in Syria. Anyone who did not adhere to their extremist ideology. So this is the reality that we face. There are, unfortunately, a lot of bad people in the world, some of them dictators and leaders of these other countries. The United States cannot continue to be in a position thinking that we can be the policemen of the world, spending trillions of taxpayer dollars coming out of our pockets, coming out of our communities, to go and launch these wars that we've seen in Iraq and Libya and Syria have caused so much suffering.
Now, since the beginning of all this weapons of mass destruction, regime change, pockets of resistance, targets of opportunity business, it's been difficult to have an honest discussion about the direction President Bush is taking this country. Well, tonight it all changes. We're going to have an honest, open debate between the President of the United States and the one man we believe has the insight and the cojones to stand up to him. So first, joining us tonight, George W. Bush, 43rd President of the United States. Welcome, Mr. President.
Good evening. I'm pleased to take your questions tonight.
Well, thank you very much, sir. I'm pleased to ask them. Taking the other side, joining us from the year 2000, Texas Governor and presidential candidate George W. Bush.
Good evening.
Thank you, Governor. Mr. President, you won the coin toss. The first question will go to you. Why is the United States of America using its power to change governments in foreign countries?
We must stand up for our security and for the permanent rights and the hopes of mankind. The United States of America will make that stand.
Well, certainly that represents a bold new doctrine in foreign policy, Mr. President. Governor Bush, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm not so sure the role of the United States is to go around the world and say this is the way it's got to be.
All right, well, that's interesting. That's a difference of opinion, and certainly that's what this country is about. Differences of opinion. Mr. President, let me just get specific. Why are we in Iraq?
We will be changing the regime of Iraq for the good of the Iraqi people.
Governor, then I'd like to hear your response on that.
If we're an arrogant nation, they'll resent us. I think one way for us to end up being viewed as the ugly American is for us to go around the world saying, we do it this way, so should you.
Well, that's an excellent point. I don't think you can argue with that. Mr. President, is the idea to just build a new country that we like better?
We will tear down the apparatus of terror, and we will help you to build a new Iraq that is prosperous and free. I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building.
Where is the conversation about peace? Every time we launch these interventionist regime change wars, it is not only our veterans who pay the price for that. Every single one of us pays the price. We have spent trillions of your taxpayer dollars to pay for these wars, taking those dollars away from our communities and our people who need them right here at home.
Madam President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I rise today to let the American people know that there are some of us left in Washington, some of your representatives, who actually do care about the mounting debt. We now have over $22 trillion worth of debt. And you ask yourself, whose fault is this? How did it get so out of control? How do we accumulate so much debt that we're accumulating debt at $1.5 million every minute? Under the first George W. Bush, the debt went from about $5 trillion to $10 trillion. Under President Obama, it went from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. Under President Trump, it'll go from 20 to about 30 trillion. So the debt is out of control, and you ask yourself, why is no one doing anything about it? Whose fault is it? Well, really, I think you can see that it's a bipartisan problem. Both parties are at fault. So we have a debt now that exceeds $22 trillion. If you've ever seen the debtclock.org, you can see just the numbers spinning out of control.
Here's the debtclock.org from June 4th of 2019 at about 7 p.m. Central Time. Our debt is going up by over $10,000 a second. We owe $67,000 per person, $181,000 per taxpayer. Now, the debtclock.org has a feature called Clock Time Machine. If we click back here, we can see what our debt was in 2008, and it's going to show us that next. It was half of what it is now at $10 trillion. We can go back to 2004, when Bush was launching the first Iraq war, and our debt was $7 trillion. And most disturbingly, you go back to the year 2000, and our debt was $5 trillion, and it was going down by $10,000 per second. Most Americans don't realize if George W. Bush had not been elected president in 2000, and we had not done the war on terror, this country was projected to be debt-free by the year 2013. 2013, this country would have been debt-free, because we've already lost over $100,000 of debt since I started recording this video in the year 2000.
So it is a real problem. As interest on the debt rises, it sort of crowds out all other spending. So what are people doing about it? What are your senators doing about it? And what are your congressmen doing about it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The Democrats control the House. Will they have a budget this year? So far, goose egg, no budget. How about the Republicans in the Senate? Do they have a budget? Well, they did pass one out, but there's no plans of ever voting on it on the floor. We're spending $50 billion a year in Afghanistan. And even for those who advocate staying in Afghanistan another decade or more, which I don't, we're spending the money on wasteful things. We spent $90 million on a luxury hotel across from our embassy. It was never completed. It's a shell of a building, and the Taliban can crawl up in this building and shoot down at our embassy. Now our soldiers have to risk life and limb to patrol an empty hotel that somebody ripped us off on for $90 million and fled the country. We built a $45 million gas station in Afghanistan. It's supposed to cost $500,000. 83 cost overruns later, it cost $45 million.
Taken countless lives. This cost is something that we cannot accept. We need to end these regime change wars, end this new Cold War and nuclear arms race we are in, and bring the trillions of dollars that we are spending on these wars and these weapons and invest them in our people, in our communities, by doing things like providing health care for all, by making sure we get a quality education for our kids. By making sure we're fixing the broken infrastructure in this country, by actually investing in our future.